Okie dokie. So we had finished up through Revelation 13, and we saw in Revelation 13 that the world is now under the authority of the Antichrist and his biggest supporter, the false prophet, right? They are both empowered by Satan. They were described as three separate beasts, right? A beast from the land, a beast from the sea, and the great dragon. So they waged war against the true believers, the born again Christians, during the tribulation. Now, this is during the first 3.5 years. There's this false religious system. It's called the Great Harlot, which we'll talk about later. But there's this religious system. Then there's all the true believers, the born again believers who believed the words of the 144,000 or believed the two witnesses and were coming to Christ. And the Antichrist is not too happy about that. So he wages war, right? And the two witnesses, ultimately, during the first 3.5 years, they're untouchable. But then at the end of the 3.5 years, when their ministry was done, the Antichrist kills them. But of course, 3.5 days later, they rise up and they're raptured to heaven. Now, the church has already been raptured 3.5 years before. And now this 3.5 years in, so we're in the mid-trib period, the period of time of the witnessing of the 144,000 is also coming to a close. So now we're going to see a transition of who is witnessing to the world to end up being angels flying across the sky. I mean, there's not really any question who God is at this point. There's evidence beyond evidence beyond evidence, right? He's giving every single person on the planet every opportunity to come to know the truth. And that's where we're going to begin chapter 14. And this, again, is a mid-tribulation scene. And then it leads in to the remaining 3.5 years, which is the Great Tribulation, as we call it. So Revelation chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. So Mount Zion, that's a really interesting place, a location in the Bible. It is one of the highest points right outside the old city of Jerusalem. It's a place where tourists go because that's where reportedly there's the tomb of David, the room where the Last Supper was held, where Mary is supposedly buried. So David, when did Mount Zion first come on the map? Well, David, he actually captured the fortress of Zion when he was first anointed king over all of Israel. That's back in 2 Samuel chapter 5. The history of Zion is actually before that, though. It is the same area that Abraham climbed with his young son. When I say young, probably 20s or 30s, right? He goes up with Isaac and he bound him to sacrifice him way back in Genesis chapter 22. And he names the place the Mount of the Lord. So before it was called the City of David, it was called the Mount of the Lord. So there is something important going to be seen here, according to Abraham. In Genesis 22:14, he says, and Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh. As it is said to this day, in the Mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And of course, that's going to lead up to where Jesus is ultimately crucified, right? So David, he later buys that property in order to pay for his sin of taking a census of the people, right? And not paying the required tribute and taking the census to put his faith in his army rather than in God. So he needs to pay for the sin of himself and to stop the plague that's killing thousands of Israelites. So he purchased it from the Jebusites. The Jebusites are the ones who originally lived on Mount Zion. So 2 Samuel 5:6 tells us where they were. It says, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither. Thinking David cannot come in hither. They thought David could not invade their fortress at Mount Zion. That says, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David. So he invaded and he took over Mount Zion. And then we know that the Jebusites continued to live there as loyal subjects. Then in that time where he took the census, he comes up, it says in 1 Chronicles 21:18, the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to say to David that David should go up and set up an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So that's where he purchases that threshing floor. He makes a sacrifice, and the plague is stopped. So what happens on that area? Does anyone remember? That's the same place where Solomon, that exact spot where Solomon would build, I believe, what would have been one of the wonders of the world. People all around the world came to see this magnificent temple of Solomon. So in 2 Chronicles 3:1, it says, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the old name for Mount Zion, where the Lord appeared unto David, his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So that name of the mountain is going to change from Mount Moriah to Mount Zion. Just as in many places in the Bible, God changes names. He even promises to give the overcomers a new name. That comes from, I believe, Revelation chapter 2. So he changes the name for the purpose that it's going to be. So the mountain of Zion became called this also the city of David. And it's associated, forever attached to the unconditional promises that God says to David, that he's going to make the descendant of David a permanent ruler for all time. Okay. So in Psalm 132, verse 11, all the way through 14 says, the Lord hath sworn in truth unto David. He will not turn from it. Of the fruit of the body will I set upon of the fruit of thy body will I set upon thy throne. If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony I shall teach them, their children also shall sit upon thy throne forevermore. So there was a rule. He said, listen, David, one of your children will sit on this throne forever. If your kids keep my promises, it'll be from their line. But of course, we know that the kids did not keep the promises, right? David's family did not follow God's rules the way they ought to. So we end up having the line of Christ coming through Nathan rather than through Solomon. But it still had to come from David because that was an unconditional promise. It says in verse 13, for the Lord hath chosen Zion. He hath desired it for his habitation. He wants to live there. All right. And that's exactly where the temple was built. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. So you're going to find the name Zion mentioned over 150 times in the Bible. Even today, there are people in Israel called Zionists, right? That's the term they still use today. Now, yes, that's true. All over America, there's places called Zion, right? Now, again, it's often called the city of David. Sometimes it's called the city of Jerusalem, even though it's technically outside of Jerusalem. And often it represents all of Israel in Scripture. But it also refers to the dwelling of Jesus during the millennium, where salvation will actually be found. So in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, it says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go unto the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now, this is interesting because Zion here is spoken of as if it's way higher than any of the mountains we know today. So we understand that the actual Zion that this is symbolizing may not be the physical Zion we know today. We know there's a Jerusalem today, but we know there's a new Jerusalem coming with a new Zion. In Joel chapter 2, verse 32, it says, and it came to pass, and it shall come to pass, that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. That has come to pass, has it not? For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord has said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. So here we have a current prophecy already fulfilled. Anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And there is a time yet future that the remnant will be called to Mount Zion, right? So that earthly mountain of Moriah became known as Mount Zion because it's the place where God chose to dwell in the temple that Solomon built. It became a representation of Jerusalem, and more importantly, the coming new Jerusalem, where Jesus will rule and reign during the millennium. So in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22, see you later. But he says, but you are come unto Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. So that the book of Hebrews, we see that Mount Zion is going to represent the heavenly dwelling of Jesus come to earth, where we're going to find saved people that are perfected, where we're going to find angels, right? We're going to find all the things that we actually find during the millennial reign in the New Jerusalem, right? In Micah chapter 4, verse 7, it says, and I will make her that halted a remnant, and her that was cast off a strong nation. And the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth, even forever. Yes, sir.
Is Mount Zion to be public above the earth?
So there's a few different views on that. Some people see that the New Jerusalem coming to earth and the temple and everything would actually come down over top of the old Jerusalem, where the valley splits, where Jesus's feet touch the Mount of Olives. I tend to take it as it will actually be in the air. It'll be a hovering or whatever, as you might want to call it, in the air where Jesus dwells there. So we actually are in, because the size of this city.
So above everything.
Yes.
The mountain.
Above all the mountains that exist. And the size of the city given in the book of Revelation is enormous. I mean, humongous, way bigger than what we think of as Israel today. And the size of the temple is a mile square. It's incredibly large. So yeah, we'll see, but I tend to believe that it's hovering. So now, where we are now in Revelation, now that we understand a little bit more about Mount Zion being representative of the New Jerusalem where we will dwell for the millennium, we're going to see where these people are at, right? Mount Zion on earth was the dwelling place of God, but symbolic of the heavenly temple. Now, there is a temple that exists during the millennium. And again, it's huge, it's massive, and it's bigger than any temple and more glorious than any temple that has ever existed on this earth. And that New Jerusalem's coming down. Well, now we see these 144,000 Jewish men that were sealed in their foreheads with God. Now, with the name of God. So where have we seen these people before? Well, that's back in chapter 7. In chapter 7, verse 3, it says, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of God, of our God, in their foreheads. And then it goes through and recounts, there'll be 12,000 from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 from Judah, 12,000 from all these different groups, and it comes up to 144,000. So we don't need to guess if this is a different group or the same group. It's the same group. Just as we don't need to guess who the Lamb is, right? We've already seen the Lamb because he's been seen in Revelation as well. And that's, of course, Jesus Christ. So a lot of people, they question, is this the heavenly Jerusalem or the literal Mount Zion? Because they want to know, is Jesus back on earth in the Mount Zion that you can go visit today, and these 144,000 there with him? I tend to understand, no, it's actually a heavenly picture. It's a picture of the new Mount Zion that's going to be part of the new Jerusalem. Why do I say that? Because Jesus has not yet returned to earth. He is waiting to return to earth till very specific events happen. And when he returns to earth, he doesn't come to Mount Zion. He comes to the Mount of Olives. So in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 3 through 4, it says, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and towards the west, and there shall be a very great valley. And half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. In Acts chapter 1, verse 9, all the way down through 12, it says, and when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, all the disciples had just seen Jesus start to ascend. He gave them the plan that the Holy Spirit was going to come in 10 days. He says, and when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly towards heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, you men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, so shall come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. Okay, so where were they? It says in verse 12, then they returned unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey. Okay, so that tells us that Jesus is going to be returning to the Mount of Olives, and that's why I see this as a picture of the first people on the new Mount Zion in the new heavenly Jerusalem is going to be the 144,000, the first from this tribulation age to go there. Okay, so then we get to verse 3 of Revelation 14. So what are these 144,000 doing? And they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000, which were redeemed from the earth. So that's why, again, this heavenly Mount Zion, these are the first new occupants that come out of the tribulation. In the middle of the tribulation, what was that? Oh, okay, sorry. In the middle of the tribulation, what's that? They were all virgins. That's correct. So they, in the middle of tribulation, they've been called to be with the Lord. What was that? That is a good question. And that actually leads to a few theories. That's what some people have suggested. That's correct. So in the middle of the tribulation, these 144,000 who were untouchable, right? They were sealed. None of the judgments of God could touch them. They have been called to be with the Lord. So some people talk about a mid-tribulation rapture. This is the closest evidence I can find to one, but it's not of the whole church. It's of these initial Jewish believers, the beginning of the remnant of Israel. These first 144,000, okay? They go during the middle of the tribulation to be with Jesus. That means they've completed their mission of their first 3.5 years. So now let's hear more details. And as you mentioned a moment ago, they were all virgins. How do we know that? Verse 4 and 5.
You back up to 3 for a second.
Yes, sir.
They sang the new song before the four beasts and the elders.
That's also in heaven.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's more evidence it was in heaven.
And that they're
of course
not the elders.
It's after the rapture of the church, because the church is there symbolized by the elders.
Absolutely right. So we can see these are all heavenly imagery for these people. So it says in verse 4.
That's the same image, like being retold from the first couple chapters when you see the whole scene up there, or is that too?
So in the first scene of heaven.
Remember that whole scene with 24 elders and the harvest and the singing.
So in that chapter, the only people present before the throne, there were angels, and infinite amount of angels. There were the four beasts, and there were the 24 elders. There was no one else there. And their song, this is different. That song anyone can learn. The lyrics are in the Bible, right? It actually tells us the lyrics of the 24 elders. Here, these 144,000, they sing a song, even though they're here with the elders. See, in verse 3, it says, they sung as it were a new song before the throne and before the four beasts and the elders. But no man could learn that song except the 144,000. Even the 24 elders could not learn that song. So they are separate from the 24 elders who are already there. So this isn't a retelling. This is something new from the tribulation. These people join up. Okay. So then we get to verse 4 and 5 that says, these are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. They were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. These are the redeemed. They're saved, right? They're redeemed from men. So in the end of the previous chapter, remember in the previous chapter, the Antichrist and his false prophet are forcing everyone to get the mark of the beast and going to be cutting off heads and killing people, right? That was all bad news for the tribulation saints or Christians after the rapture, right? That's the other term for the tribulation saints on the earth. They're being overcome by the false prophet, the false lamb, and he's destroying them. They're being destroyed around the world. But here at the same time, there is rejoicing on Mount Zion. The 144,000 that were sealed back in chapter 7, they now stand with him. They sing that song that not even the church can sing, and no one can learn it. It is a special worship song between them and Christ. The bride is still in heaven. Remember, the church is still in heaven, not part of this group. They are separate from this group. Now, again, some people, they've made the argument, well, maybe these are a different 144,000, right? I think they're the same. It's described specifically as the ones who are sealed in their foreheads, right? Which seems to me an obvious reference back to our original group. That's how I know. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they tend to believe they're the only ones who go to heaven. Yeah. Yeah, and obviously I disagree with that. Well, yeah, now they've reassigned. Well, maybe those other people weren't there. But every single, it is, and they don't care for that either. But every single one of these 144,000 remain alive, just as God had promised to seal and protect them back in chapter 7 from the coming judgments of the four winds. And I'll just read those verses, then I'll get to you, Becky. It says in Revelation 7:1, says, after these things, I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds, or the four judgments of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried out loud with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of God in their foreheads. You cannot unleash your fury until these people are protected. And indeed, this chapter proves that every last one of them was protected, because God means what he says and he says what he means. Go ahead, Becky. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean,
Wrap my head around it. So chapter 7, they're mentioned 144,000.
they're given their task to preach to the world. Correct.
Yeah, sealed to the first redeemed. And then so they are spending that time on the earth then.
Correct. And they're spending that time witnessing about Jesus,
Okay.
right?
But
Because
then
they're considered his servants.
they're here, and they're seen with Jesus though.
So we're 3.5 years later from their original scene, right? So during the time of their witnessing, the two witnesses are in Jerusalem, spreading the gospel in Jerusalem, right? And bringing down all these signs and wonders. And these 144,000 are presumably worldwide preaching the gospel. There are many people coming to salvation during this time. At the end of the 3.5 years, the first 3.5 years. So we started at the beginning of a 7-year period. The church has been raptured. These 144,000 are tasked now to do what the church had been tasked to do, to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. And increasingly lukewarm at it, right? And once that church is removed, the overcomers are removed, these 144,000 are assigned as servants of God. And again, we talk about servants of God, and what does the servants of God always do? Bring the message of God to the people. Good.
Do you think they're active people or
I do believe they're actual physical people. Correct.
ghosts?
No, I don't. Right, like some kind of spiritual being or something. No, yeah, right.
Like he magically pop out of the earth during the rapture, they magically pop in.
Right. I don't tend to believe so. I don't tend to believe so. Now, like I said, some people believe they're the resurrected children that died whenever Jesus was born. I mean, I think it's fascinating.
Here somehow, right?
Well, there's been people resurrected in the Bible before.
They were actually born and then they.
No, they would, if that theory were true, then they would physically be resurrected, just like we saw people resurrected at Jesus's death. But if that theory is not true, if they're just 144,000 Jewish people, which again, that we can rest assured, there are 144,000 that are sealed. We don't know maybe their origins, but we know that they are physically people. And the fact that we know they're physically people is because they need protected from things that kill people, right? They have to be sealed, and all the judgments have to be held back until they're sealed. If they were some kind of spiritual being, that wouldn't really make sense. Well, he talks about which tribe they're from. and he says they are men, right? And it talks about how they have to be protected from the dangers that are coming upon the earth. Yes, sir. I'm sorry? No one knows. So you can't say with certainty, they may be alive today and not even realize that they're going to accept Jesus at the rapture. They may not be aware if they're just regular people. They also may be a very select group that God has chosen, just like God chose the 12 apostles, right? They were chosen and they were foreordained. But these people, they may be random people today. And after the rapture, they come to Christ. The Bible doesn't tell us. People can speculate, and that's all it is speculation as to their identity. We can just know what the Bible tells us to know. And one thing, it tells us that they are able to have relationships and families, but they have chosen to stay virgins and remain single so they can devote themselves to Christ. That's what Revelation 14 tells us.
Another speculation. I heard one fellow said, and I can't quote, I don't remember who the guy was.
No problem.
He very clearly said that there are now enough Orthodox Jews, and they have very strict rules about purity. And he said there are enough now that you can find 144,000 males, like
Mhm.
teenagers,
Yeah.
that have kept themselves pure because of very strict religious view on intimacy.
Mhm.
And so he said it could happen today. There could be 144,000.
Yeah, if they wanted to use the current population of the world. So there's all kinds of speculation. But what we really need to understand from all this is that they become wholly devoted to God once they've accepted him at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation. And they're protected in order to deliver his message for the next 3.5 years. And then here, they're going to be removed from the earth, right? And they're described as young male virgins. They are the redeemed, right? They said that there is nothing in verse 5. It says, in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. Let me tell you something. The only humans that are without fault before the throne of God are those whose sins have been paid for. That's it. There's none righteous, no, not one, including these folks, unless Jesus made them righteous, right? So these men, they're the first fruits. They're the redeemed, right? So millions have been redeemed throughout history, ever since the man on the cross, right? The thief on the cross right next to Jesus. So how are these people the first fruits? Well, it's because they're the first fruits of a new time, a new dispensation. They are the first that were separated and sealed by the Holy Spirit after the close of the church age or the grace dispensation, whatever you want to call it. They're really the first of the tribulation saints. So it says that the nation of Israel, there's going to be a remnant of Israel who accepts Jesus during the tribulation. Well, guess who the first of that remnant is? It's these people. They're all Jews, right? They're the first fruits of the remnant who are redeemed. So the rest of the world has gone after the Antichrist, chasing that deception of the Antichrist, and these instead have devoted their lives to the service of the true Christ, the true Messiah. So a lot of people devote themselves to family. They want to raise kids, they want to protect their kids. These people devoted something that Paul talked about. He said, I wish that all people could be like I am, right? I want everyone to serve Christ first, because the person who's married, he cares about the things of his wife and how to make her happy and to give her things. And the same thing for the wife, for the husband. These people are totally devoted. They understand the time is short and the days are evil, right? And they sing this song that no one, again, not even the church, can learn. The heavenly creatures could not sing the song. And no matter how many times you heard it, you can't sing it yourself.
So do these men die and go to heaven, or are they
Raptured mid-trib to go to heaven, separate from the church.
So there's 2 raptures?
Well, I would say there's more. And we'll talk more about that later, because even at the end of the tribulation, right, there is a gathering of the saints and then a gathering of the wicked, right?
Right.
So we'll talk more about that when we get to the end of the tribulation. And I believe that if people were to actually just take the Bible for what it says, a lot of that confusion goes away. If you understand who am I addressing with the rapture of the church, well, Paul looks forward to it as the next thing. That's something that could happen at any time before all this. This is a separate issue.
What's the word church mean?
What does the word church mean? Enlighten us. Honestly, I'm not sure what I look at.
Basically means call out. called out.
Called out,
The
okay.
Greek ecclesia.
Notice. There are many called out people and groups. That's why it's the bride coming forward. The bride's coming out of church. She's coming out of those who are called out. But there are many who are called out.
I think the
You've
new,
got it down.
I know, I failed that one. Good, thank you, though. I appreciate that.
I think the new song's gonna be kind of like algebra. I couldn't learn that either.
It's like, what? Algebra,
Algebra.
right? But no, it's gonna be something that no one else can sing, right?
I think the song come out of experience with the Lord,
Mhm.
time and season.
So along those same lines, these people are not the same as the bride of Christ.
No, right.
The bride of Christ is a very unique position. So being saved today, being part of the bride, right? It's not just about attending a church. It's not just about having a Bible. It's not just about, it's about having a personal relationship where Christ has purchased you, forgiven you, you've accepted it, and living with him. It's a wonderful thing that you can have peace today and avoid these terrible things that are going to happen. Okay. So being saved today and being saved during the tribulation, they both save you from the lake of fire. They both give you eternal security in heaven. All right. That's not what we're worried about. Same position. But the greatest position you can hold in regards to rewards and just your position in heaven is to be part of the bride, be part of the bride of Christ. And even within the church, even within the bride, there is different inheritances and rewards. And you can read more about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it talks about the believers being judged at the judgment seat of Christ, where your work can either be gold or silver or precious stones, or it can be wood, hay, or stubble.
And nothing. Or nothing.
Or nothing. And if it's nothing, you'll still be saved, but you'll suffer loss, right? You won't have that same reward and inheritance. So these 144,000 have survived the Antichrist's effort to destroy them. And the reason that we're seeing them sealed now in heaven is to show that the Antichrist and Satan and all of their power and all of their authority could not hurt a single one of them. None of them were missing. It wasn't 143,000, wasn't 143,999. It was 144,000. And this is a very strong message and witness to the remaining people in Israel who are going to have to face a very difficult decision. Do I submit to the Antichrist, or do I face the future with Jesus, even though it's going to be a hard time on this earth, right? Should I face the wrath of the Antichrist? Remember, Jesus had warned them, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee, because it's going to get bad, right? So the church is in heaven now. The two witnesses are in heaven now. The 144,000 Jewish men, these first fruits of the tribulation of the remnant of Israel, is in heaven. So who's going to be spreading the gospel here on the earth during the time of the power of the Antichrist? Well, the tribulation saints are getting
No, I was just gonna say,
killed.
maybe before we go to the next section.
Oh, no, we are going to. I'm actually just going to do this last couple verses. So in verse 6 and 7, it says, and I saw another angel. So now after these 144,000 are with Jesus on Mount Zion, it says, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. Then he tells us what that everlasting gospel is, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of water. Now I'm going to stop before we talk about these verses, but I want you to look at that gospel that he just gave, verse 7, and think about it during the break and ask yourself, is that the gospel that Paul gives us? Or is that something else? So we'll take a break here and we'll pick up in about 5 minutes.